Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Welcome back. We'll take 10-20 seconds to wait for everyone to come back from the coffee break. Okay, welcome back everyone. So after this very inspiring eNOTICE panel with a lot of nice discussions and questions, we will pursue with another afternoon session, and it's the last one. That's the good news. So it's just us between you and the networking reception. There will be now the proactive session, which will tackle the same topic, what we learned from the field training exercises. On the proactive side, we do not have a panel discussion. It's short presentations with discussion and questions at the end. And for this, I will first like to introduce you to two of our proactive consortium partners, core consortium partners. The first one is Tony Godwin from CBRNE Limited. Tony then will introduce himself and give you a first presentation. Then we will follow with Åsa Burlin from the Umeå University in Sweden, at the European CBRNE Center. And then we will have two testimonies, or testimonials, never know what is the good word for this, testimonies from two of the proactive CSAB members. So you know from the first presentation what is the CSAB. And for this we have Luca Rotondi. He will come on the podium later to present. And we have also a recorded video. So not without further ado, we will commence. And Tony, I welcome you to the speaker's place.
Thank you, Grigori. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tony Godwin. As Grigori said, I'm with CBRNE Limited, one of the SMEs within the project of Proactive. And my role has been to coordinate from the proactive perspective the field exercises. I got a phone call asking me, would you be interested in delivering some field exercises? My background is in law enforcement and in CBRN as a responder and as a commander, and I've also run training courses in other areas of policing. So I thought, how hard can it be? Oh, how wrong I was. There's a lot more involved in bringing these kinds of training exercises together, and hopefully I can just give a little bit of a flavour of that this afternoon, and a bit more of a flavour of how we went through some of the processes, but also some of the learning, and go back to Chaim's question earlier, how do we take this forward and what we've learned, and how can other people benefit from it? So lessons learned from the 3 field training exercises, or from a guide dog to an exercise guide. This all started probably 10 years ago with some conversations, and then in 2017, Dominic and Grigori started a conversation at an exercise where a guide dog was involved, obviously with a person that needed the guide dog, and they started asking the question about, well, how do we deal with the less than normal situations that we all train for? Most of you in the room who have been involved in any form of CBRN training train with each other. Certainly my CBRN training, I was either a victim and I knew exactly what was coming, or I was a practitioner and I knew the victims knew exactly what was coming. So how do we take it a step further and actually involve people who are most affected by it but don't know what's happening? So that was the remit, and it grew into Project Proactive. So it's 28 degrees. You've all been out and had a drink. It's 10 to 5 in the afternoon. So just to try and keep you awake for a bit, I'm just going to show a video. So if we can just show a video in relation to the Rieti exercise, those of you who were there would recognize some of it, but some of you who weren't there, hopefully this will give you a little bit of a flavor of what these exercises are about. The proactive objectives for today were to work in partnership with eNOTICE to deliver an exercise, a multi-agency exercise that integrated members of the public, civil society, into emergency services exercising. We have today brought 37 members of the local community, including a large number of vulnerable people with visible vulnerabilities, but also invisible vulnerabilities, just to test the emergency services to see if they can identify those people and manage their needs.
The overall aim of the Proactive project is to have a better harmonization of the standard operating procedures of CBRNE incidents from practitioners and to better articulate and take into account the needs of vulnerable groups in those SOPs.
Communication is one of the most important tasks in any incident, especially in the CBRNE incident. And for this task, we've developed the app, which was used today successfully.
The Proactive app is a very important tool. We have the opportunity to report an incident, and also we do have this exceptional choice of the CBRNE library. They provide valuable info for our preparedness.
The scenario was a case in chemical events in the city. The value added from the public in this kind of training is amazing. This is a really rare occasion to work training as you fight. The capability to communicate with the vulnerable people and that spontaneous reaction of the people merge with our procedures. This is the most important things.
Today we managed to involve some adolescents, and we are very glad about that. I think it was exciting, and it was a great opportunity to bring together citizens and first responders. I think we learned so much from today. I truly believe it was a unique educational opportunity to raise awareness on disaster preparedness and learn from one another.
I think it was a great next step in working with vulnerable people and first responders. I've seen a lot, so we've learned a lot, and now it's a question of putting it all together and using it for our next exercise.
Okay, if you're under any impression that those exercises are easy, just see how tired I looked at that interview at the end of that at the end of that day, and boy did it rain and rain and rain all day. So it was great to get through that with such enthusiasm from the people. So the task set was to coordinate 3 joint exercises in collaboration with eNOTICE, who will be our hosts at 3 locations. So that's 3 countries, 3 hosts, 4 organisations, and you've heard from Daniele Di Giovanni from Tor Vergata, who was also very much involved in the planning and delivery, and to include first responders from fire, medical, law enforcement, civil protection, railways, and the military. So bringing a lot of people together, along with the twist, which is to bring to the exercises members of civil society as volunteers from local communities. And that's the local communities of Dortmund, Rieti, and Ranst. And then just to add another further twist to it, 15% at least of those volunteers need to be classed as vulnerable, and not just obvious vulnerabilities that couldn't necessarily be seen. So that was the task set to us. And we could only deliver that in partnership. And you've heard earlier today the value of working in partnership. So effectively, what was set up was a tripartite arrangement where everybody within the partnership had a voice. Everybody had something to bring to it. So there was FDDO, Fire Department of Dortmund, the University of Rome, Tor Vergata lead, the Scuola Difesa in Rieti, and Campus Vesta. So bringing some real big hitters together and quite a wide range of experience to deliver this. And to bring so many groups together, it was really important that we set some objectives, so strategic objectives. And Micah talked earlier about the requirement for setting strategic objectives, taking things forward. And that's all about the working in partnership, but also what we were trying to achieve, just with some overarching principles. Behind those, we set a load of tactical objectives for each exercise, which developed over the 3 exercises. I'm not going to read all those out, but it's very much focused on ensuring we involve the right people to start with, so the right members of civil society. What we wanted to try and test and evaluate, so that's first responders, about their ability to recognise and deal with the needs of vulnerable people. To look at some of the tools that Proactive was bringing, for example, the pre-incident information that we were going to give to our civil society volunteers and see if that made any difference. Did it help? Did they remember? Did they react in a different way because they had been receiving some information? Spoiler alert here, yes, they did. To evaluate if the communication processes used with the public during an incident were appropriate. Again, we make some assumptions that everyone's understanding what we're saying, understanding our acronyms, understanding what we're expecting them to do. And that proved very much during these exercises that it wasn't the case. Add that into the mix, someone who can't see, someone who can't hear, the whole problem becomes so much more complicated for first responders. So there's an opportunity to try and see if we could find new ways to help first responders deal with those in the real world. We also will have the Proactive Crisis Communication System, which is app-based and a web platform, which you'll hear a lot more about tomorrow, I think it is, but wanted to test that in a live environment and to understand factors also which increase public compliance. So the factors that make people want to be compliant in these sort of incidents rather than want to maybe fight back or not cooperate. And the final one, a huge part of Proactive project has been about looking at the ethical principles and the dilemmas faced by first responders and other organisations to look at some of the societal issues involved in dealing with civil society in these CBRNE incidents, but also how people with vulnerabilities are affected even more so. And on top of that, actually how the ethical considerations of bringing civil society into exercises that's putting them directly at some risk and giving them some immediate exposure to what might happen in the real world. And you probably might be quite surprised at the outcome of that because most of you certainly know there's been a reluctance to inform people about CBRN in the past, and our findings have been quite startling about how important it is for people to know, particularly when it comes to the people we try to protect most, like children, who are very influential in how we take things forward. So, the challenges then. The first meeting in Birmingham, Liz talked about Birmingham, didn't go very well, actually. And Grigori and Olga are probably shuffling in their seats now, wondering about what's he going to say. But it was a difficult start. We were coming from cross purposes. We had different views. We had different ideas about what this should look like. And quite frankly, at the end of the formal meeting, when we were sat in that office, everyone was huddled at either end. The projects were huddled at either end. And everyone was thinking, this could be a bit challenging because we're working at cross purposes. But thankfully, Liz had laid on a nice pub for us in the evening, and we had a nice meal, and the atmosphere started to defrost somewhat. And we started talking, and we started moving forward. And we knew then that there were always going to be problems, there was always going to be conflict. But I think I've heard the word family used more in these two projects than I think I have in any other project that I've been involved in, or even actually in any other organisation I've been involved in. And yeah, families fall out, families have difficulties, but actually they get resolved and we deliver in the end. And I think that's, to me, one of the big parts of this journey that we've been on and are still on around that. Yes, we've all got cultural differences in the way we operate. We've talked about different SOPs from our emergency services, but also our populations behave differently. As you move through different parts of Europe, there's different expectations on our public and how they're treated. And then we all got going, and we all went to Rieti, and we all went to Rome, and we started things going, and then it all stopped. So we hit the pandemic, and we've talked a lot about that today and the impact it had. As we pointed out in the previous session, it's very difficult to run a field exercise during a pandemic. So we were thinking, what are we going to do? We need to keep the momentum going. We need to try and keep people engaged and interested. We've put a lot of effort into where we've got to. We can't just let it go at this stage. So Grigori and the team worked really hard with Olga and eNOTICE to make sure that we got extended. I think we've probably been extended more than any other project ever. And as Grigori mentioned earlier, we started engaging with our civil society organisations, with our practitioners, with the view to, as soon as possible, bringing them together. We ran some virtual tabletop exercises, which were a great learning for us, and then we were able to bring them all together in a physical tabletop exercise in Paris, which really started to highlight to us the disconnect between what civil society thought and what our first responders thought. And there was some really useful learning came out of that. And I refer back to the start about the dog. And the answer from all our first responders to the blind person's dog was, we shoot the dog, because that's what we do. And there was no sort of consideration for anything else. So we'll come back to the dog possibly later. Challenges around recruitment of volunteers. How do you convince somebody to come along to an exercise, not get paid, find their own way there, stand in front of something that's going to be potentially unpleasant, then take all their clothes off, then be sprayed with water, then get them redressed, and then ask them how it went? It was quite a challenging process to go through getting volunteers on board. Afterwards, they all thought it was great fun, and some of them said, I'd pay to do that, but at the start, it's quite a difficult message to get out to people. And we've had a lot of help through the process of bringing volunteers on board at all the sites, because it's been quite a challenge, particularly as we move forward, trying to get more and more volunteers for each exercise. So locations and transportation were also a challenge for us. Is it a good idea to try and bring civilian members of the public to a secure military site? What are the challenges around that? And I'll explore that a bit more later. Transportation. So many of you will know your training locations are not in the most convenient places. So how do we get people to those? And how do we deal with those issues? The language barriers. When we started the project, the 3 field exercises were in countries where members of the consortium were also were language speakers. By the time we got going, we didn't have that. So we were trying to deliver exercises in countries where we didn't have any internal local language. My Italian has improved, but Daniele will probably tell me it's still only good for pizza and wine. But security and vetting, going back to bringing people to various different sites. There was a requirement, particularly at the MBC school in Rieti, that everybody who attended had to be vetted, and they had to be vetted in advance. So we now, faced with these wicked problems, we're trying to get volunteers, but actually we're also making it hard for them to be allowed to come along. And we had to give such forward notice of who was coming initially, because some of you will be aware of Italian bureaucracy when it comes to things like that. It was getting very challenging. And Gianpaolo at the MBC school was able to flex and say, okay, well, who's coming? And we'll see what we can do. And last minute, we were able to bring 4 migrants to the exercise, which probably we got Lee a bit worried about, but we were able to bring those people along. And the other thing is, when you think you're ready, I can guarantee there's a lot more to do. We always arrived early for the exercise. Printing took forever because everything had to be done in paper copies because people had to sign things, and everything changed at the last minute. I alluded to the fact that it was just a little bit wet in Rieti. We had to change the plans at the last minute because we couldn't use what we had in place. We had a contingency for wet weather, but that had to be adapted as we were going along. Running a bit out of time. Okay. Faster. Okay. So the lessons then, remain flexible at all times because you're going to have to be. Clearly define what roles and responsibilities you have and what others have. Develop detailed timeline planning. We produced spreadsheets for timeline planning, which were so detailed, but were required. Use process mapping to outline the detailed elemental activities. A lot of people involved in delivering these. So what do you do? What do you do about property? What do you do about the management of valuables? Develop contingency plans and risk assessments. You're bringing people into potentially hazardous environments. Create a living procurement to do document. You wouldn't believe how much you have to buy and have in place. Whether you've got to find spare clothing for 50 or 60 people so they can change into them so they can be decontaminated. Plan your focus groups. There's no point in doing this exercise unless afterwards you can ask people how it went and what their experiences were. And I think they'll probably speak a bit more about that when we have some question and answer sessions. A range of translation services. You desperately need those. All your volunteers will be speaking in the local language. Engage a brief professional filming photography company. You've seen the quality of the video today. Don't try and do it yourself. And the key takeaways, I'm coming to an end now, Grigori. Find a balance between proximity observers to the exercise and necessary distance to volunteers and first responders. The observers from the different organizations will have different requirements. They'll all want to get closer than you want them to be, and they'll all complain at the end that they didn't get close enough. But that's just what you have to deal with, but you need to be able to keep that reality. Define the role of the narrators, agree your exercise parameters, and the scenario outline as early as possible, but it will change, guarantee it. Early engagement with the exercise host teams and address the identified site-specific challenges, because there always will be some. Agree and ensure a consistent live dissemination protocol and stick to it. Arrange a formal start and finish to the exercise. It might not be important to you, but it's important to the volunteers that they have this sort of recognition of what they've done at the end of it. Define the registration process of all the parties involved, and expect there's going to be confusion at the start. There always is. You bring a lot of people together who don't know where they are. So the key takeaway for the volunteers, throughout the whole thing, dignity, respect, and welfare must underpin everything you do. They're there because they're volunteered to be there, but you need to look after them. Don't have too many forms, the bureaucracy puts them off. Engage your local civil society organisations. They've got a lot of answers and a lot of networks. We've talked a lot about networks. Consider the start times to allow for travel and all the things you need to do about registration. It all takes a long time. Simplify your processes. Provide your spare clothing for your volunteers. And there are unexpected consequences of that. You'll see Alfie in the pushchair. He became a focal point for the people in Rieti. Very protective of Alfie. He became their baby, and they wouldn't let go. In fact, they took him away with them. But it just demonstrates how these sort of things bring your civil society groups together. Secure personal property. So personal property is a nightmare to deal with, so you don't lose it. And when you start to put in hearing aids that are €30,000 and irreplaceable, prosthetics you can't replace, you need to look after all that. And remember, they only speak their local language. In your bags, there's an aid memoir. I'm not going to go through it because it'll give you some good information about how to involve vulnerable people and civil society in general in your exercises, but happy to discuss it afterwards and talk through it with anybody who wants to. So in conclusion, the value of joint working has shone throughout this, and I think that's been a theme for the day. The value of including civil society is virtually immeasurable. It brings so much. There are immediate and identifiable and tangible benefits including them. We're getting first-hand response from first responders immediately after the exercise and from the civil society. The learning that comes with it is worth the effort. We have moved forward. We've gone from shooting the dog to decontaminating the dog and seeing what we can do about it. But what next? You've talked a lot about that today. Adam said, don't let the outcomes disappear. Wolfgang, lessons learned process, really important. There's a lot that we've gained from these 3 exercises that we can take forward to disseminate, to develop good practice that can make life easier for our responders and for our public. And I've overrun, and I'm really sorry, Grigori, but I'm quite passionate about this subject, in case nobody noticed. So I will now finish and hand over back to you, Grigori. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. We will segue directly to the next presentation. So, Osa, please.
Does that do it? Can't lower that, but I can lower these. There we go. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Osa Bedin, and I work at Umeå University. And we were the partner responsible for engaging the Proactive Civil Society Advisory Board. And I'm going to talk about some of the lessons learned from that. So anyone who's ever attended a Proactive presentation before has probably seen this image. You just saw it about an hour ago. Grigori used it. I've used it myself a number of times because it is a good illustration and it really does the job of showing what it is that we've been trying to do, to have the people on the left better understand the needs of the people on the right, and for us as a project in the middle to really initiate and facilitate that conversation. And so this is what we set out to do, but this is what we quickly realized, that the 4 stick figures on the right really don't quite do it when it comes to representing what the vulnerable civil society look like. Vulnerable people come with all sorts of obvious and not so obvious characteristics, and trying to draw some form of line between who belongs there and who doesn't can be really tough. The people on the left in their uniforms, they represent a professional role. The people on the right do not. Vulnerable people don't have standard operating procedures. First responders, as we know, have all undergone extensive training to learn how to react and respond to various disasters and incidents. They follow procedures and protocol, and so that means that we can assume a certain level of consistency, especially within borders. So we can assume that all Swedish police, all Polish firefighters, etc., will act somewhat similarly if faced with a situation. And we can generalize to a certain extent. Vulnerable people and civil society in general really represent a wide range of conditions, vulnerabilities, disabilities, identities. They are typically not trained to react to any form of disasters, maybe specifically CBRN incidents. So we can't assume consistency, and we have to be really cautious when trying to generalize their behavior. And to further complicate things, or rather trying to highlight the difference between the CSAB, the advisory board, and the vulnerable individuals that they represent, I put this image in here. Now, we saw a need pretty early on to try to categorize the groups represented in the CSAB. For many reasons, one being when we recruited, we wanted to be able to show potential new candidates what the CSAB looked like and who was already on board, but also for us to kind of make sure that we sort of stuck to the aim of recruiting broadly, to make sure we didn't miss any obvious groups we wanted in there. And it wasn't necessarily a given to come up with these categories. And I know this is tiny and you probably can't see, but the point is to show that we were able to slice the pie, if you will, in a fairly representative way. There are some groups, like for example, we had parents of deaf children, which is a good example of an organization that could have easily be placed in both categories, both minors and children, and of course deaf and hearing impaired people. But for the most part, it was pretty straightforward where the organizations would go. If you look at the individuals, that's not necessarily the case. So as an example, now in the exercises, when we've had vulnerable volunteers, we've had wheelchair users as a category. But you might have a wheelchair user who is an athlete, who can maneuver the chair quickly, carry their own body weight, get in and out of the chair on their own. And you might have another wheelchair user who has a chronic disease, is in an electric wheelchair that they cannot necessarily maneuver quickly or on their own for that matter. And so while on the one hand we would put them in the same category, if you look at that sort of cloud of individual factors, they would be on maybe opposite ends. Being vulnerable is not a fixed state. So we have all these different components or individual factors, and then we add the situation. This is, of course, not groundbreaking news. I can't count how many times I've said, now in the event of a CBRN incident, we're all vulnerable. And it's true, and it's worth stressing, because it is a good reminder that depending on what the situation is, it really does impact how vulnerable you are. So for example, again, if you have an incident that's on or near water and you can't swim, you're very vulnerable. Whereas if you're nowhere near water, maybe that's not a factor. If you're in an incident that takes place in Japan and you don't speak Japanese, if you are traveling with your grandmother or your grandson, you're more vulnerable because you have someone depending on you that maybe isn't very independent. And so that's gonna sort of depend where on this scale you will end up depending on the situation. Not all vulnerabilities are easily identifiable. One of the key performance indicators that we used in the exercise to determine how well first responders, how good they were at identifying vulnerable people, I should say. And this can be very easy, very difficult, or really anywhere in between. Now you can obviously usually tell if a person is in a wheelchair, if they are a child or if they're with a child, if a person's ability to move is significantly compromised, if they're holding a white stick, or if they have a guide dog or a therapy animal. But it's not necessarily easy to tell if a person can read or even understand signs, if a person can hear or understand the spoken language, so can they hear you, but can they understand you? Do you speak the same language? If a person has mental health issues or a history of trauma, or if a person has a medical condition that would render them particularly vulnerable in a specific situation. So for example, if you have someone with asthma, diabetes, epilepsy, most of the times those conditions maybe would go unnoticeable. But if they have to wait a long time, they don't have access to their medication, those conditions can suddenly render them very vulnerable. And then this is not necessarily a lesson learned, but I thought I'd include it because vulnerability connected with the process of undressing is definitely an issue that we have spent a lot of time and energy on over the years. All three exercises that Proactive were involved with featured a form of decontamination. All volunteers were clearly and repeatedly instructed to wear swimsuits underneath their regular clothes. This was not up for discussion. The rule was no swimsuit, no participation. The option is, of course, ethically and morally unthinkable, and this is, of course, as Tony stressed, to protect participant dignity and well-being at all times. But there are groups where the perceived vulnerability is connected with that process. I've been asked a number of times why we chose to include LGBT organizations, for example, on the CSAT. And the answer, of course, is, well, they are a more marginalized group, and we would rather be too inclusive than too exclusive. And it's not necessarily for us to say how vulnerable a person might be. And some of those same arguments are true for Muslim women or women with hijabs. And that was a subject that for a long time we really didn't know how to approach. We also had a really hard time for a long time to recruit Muslim organizations to the CSAT, but in the end we got a few, so that was really exciting. And after some really insightful and, for me personally, very enlightening conversations with these groups, which, by the way, helped inform the aid memoir, so some of that's in there, we landed in an approach for recruiting volunteers where these groups were not excluded, but they also weren't targeted based on this perceived vulnerability. And now Campus Vesta, who organized the last exercise and also successfully and gracefully recruited all the volunteers, not just the vulnerable ones, but all the ones, we had good conversations with them where we agreed that if any volunteer that was invited to participate could wear whatever swim attire they chose. So whatever they would normally wear to the pool or beach, that's what they could wear to the exercise. And if that meant a swimsuit that covered your ankles, wrists, and hair, then that's what you would wear to the exercise. Because again, we want to protect participant dignity and well-being at all times. So in the end, it's more about rethinking and broadening the approach than it is to sort of hammer in new facts. We're not producing a user manual that says, here, do this and you'll be good. We're rather producing a toolbox of strategies where the aid memoir, again, is one of those tools. And yeah, communication goes both ways. So of course we want first responders to communicate to the vulnerable people or the civil society in general, but they also have a responsibility to communicate back, which is why it's important to engage the CSOs as well. And then I'm not presenting the results of the project. That's a different presentations, but I thought I'd mention some of the things that I personally learned over the last few years that I really didn't know before starting this. So blind or visually impaired people don't always carry the white stick. If you see someone with a white stick, it's a very good guess that they are blind or visually impaired. But if you can also have someone that lost their glasses, and without those glasses, they're very vulnerable. Guide dogs can't find their way home or anywhere else, really. The purpose of a guide dog is for the person holding the harness to not walk into traffic or not walk off a cliff or a ledge. They're not supposed to lead people to certain places. That's not their job. Sign language is not universal. Neither is Braille, although there are many languages that use a similar structure for Braille. Not all blind or visually impaired people can read Braille. If you become blind or visually impaired later in life, it can be hard to get your fingertips sensitive enough to pick it up. And the same, of course, is true for deaf or hearing impaired people. Depending on when you lost that ability, you might not know sign language. And the ability to process and understand information decreases with age. So to generalize, older people need more time to process and understand information. Of course, individual factors apply, but this is something that one of the CSAB members, who is a professor in geriatrics, told us. And to wrap it up, of course, this has been a challenge, but a very good challenge and absolutely worthwhile. There is a lot of incentive and engagement to tap into. We had a harder time recruiting for the CSAB than the PSAB. In the end, the CSAB was roughly half the size of the PSAB, but on the other side, the organizations that did join were very engaged and enthusiastic to be part of it. And yeah, we definitely just scratched the surface. There's plenty more to be done. And finally, participation can take a lot of different forms. So for example, some of those Muslim women that we spoke to, they didn't want to join the CSAB, but they still very much contributed. Another example is one of the volunteers in one of the exercises was a severely disabled person who could not participate fully in really most of the exercise activities. But simply by being there, it really sort of set the tone for what inclusion can look like. And I think that anyone who saw this person really understood what it would take in a real incident to handle them in a safe and efficient way. So that really spoke volumes. We had some CSAB members that really couldn't travel anywhere for a long time after the pandemic for the increased risk of being exposed to the virus. So then they had to participate only online. Which the lesson learned there is that although we might have an idea what participation should look like, we have to be flexible and provide for different options. And with that, I'm gonna wrap it up, and we're gonna look at the video from the first exercise that took place in Dortmund just over a year ago, when restrictions from the pandemic was still very much in place and something that we really had to deal with for that.
Proactive studies the CBRN threat from a psychological and human factor research method. Today we had the first exercise organized jointly between Proactive and eNOTICE here in Dortmund.
Proactive project is a strategic project for us because one of the eNOTICE objectives is to show to the stakeholders that the training centers of the network are open for research activities of the current research and development projects. The challenge is that training centers very seldom, or some never, did any exercise with real volunteers from the public.
The heart of the whole exercise was the volunteers. The civil society organizations helped us a lot to recruit volunteers, and they advised us furthermore how to handle the whole recruitment process. And doing so, we were able to have 50% of our volunteers being vulnerable volunteers, and they challenged the firefighters quite a lot during the exercise.
It's absolutely key to bring vulnerable groups into this training exercise because the first responders don't have normal experience of dealing with them. They're dealing with their vulnerabilities and dealing with their special needs, and even identifying them in the first place, because there's this assumption that all vulnerabilities are visible, and they're not.
The main scenario was an accident with a freight train with a tank car containing hazardous substances. And the accident happened in a smaller station. About 20 people were exposed with the hazmat substance, and the main focus was on the part of decontamination of people.
Especially for me and for the job I'm doing, I develop many ideas how we can prepare people with handicaps for such events, and probably also some ideas how rescuers can be prepared for such situations.
Herausforderungen sind, dass man den Betroffenen dann auch erklärt, was wir jetzt vorhaben, wie die Abläufe sind und auch auf Besonderheiten eingehen, wie zum Beispiel, dass wir auch Sehbehinderte oder auch nicht gehfähige Patienten mit dem Rollstuhl auch dabei haben, was wir jetzt bewusst auch vorher den übrigen Einheiten nicht mitgeteilt haben, sondern gesagt, reagiert in der Situation, und das war ein super Trainingseffekt, da waren im Nachhinein jetzt auch alle Übungsteilnehmer vom begeistert, und das hat uns wirklich nach vorne gebracht.
My impression was that even though possibly there are always tensions in exercising, it was so professional. We added value and we brought something to the exercise that wouldn't naturally have come.
The responder said, we learned a lot, and even the people are involved, the general public, they said, okay, we have now a little bit more a feeling what's going on in the CBRN event, so in our opinion, great success.
From ethical point of view, we are very pleased because it's one of the main objectives of Proactive to improve and to raise awareness about the vulnerable groups. And from social justice point of view, that is our main objective, and I think we have reached that.
I trust that the lessons learned in this exercise will contribute to a better awareness and a better response capacity in the European member states. Osa, is that all?
That's all. I'm done.
Okay. Thank you very much. You are just on time. So after these two presentations from the Proactive Consortium partners, I would like to welcome on stage Mr. Luca Rotondi. Luca is working hard in Italy for years now to make disaster and emergency response more inclusive. So Luca, please welcome. By the way, Luca is deaf, and he accepted our invitation to come here to give a testimony.
My dear colleagues, thank you very much for having me here today. And please excuse my absence for...
Testimony 01.
Good.
So we need the slides.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, Takagi. Good afternoon. That is, as the determine, I am tough. I'm sorry. I hope to speaking better English for after that. I am President of Emergency Sortie and English Staff Emergency. I am President. I have more title 5 master degree. I have master CPRN from master certificate. More I have experience from CPRN. So after more protection against international security, safety, global strategic medical emergency. So I grow the problems all, but I grow better the problems for deaf people. Emergency sortie is a small association, is from 7 years because it's from amateur earthquake. Amateur before do I have association of staff for emergency do I have, but from me have all staff, all university from emergency or for grow the problems for speaking with policemen, firemen, medical, one to emergency or problems. Is one this now is expert from video for communication for all video senior appear subtitles for all type of type because type have three type of type speaking different voice different type senior speaking more three type is a big problem. Now, take regard the invitation emergency sortie for stakeholder because it's important for grow the problems in CPRN, cited problems in Paris, problems because in Convention from United Nations, Convention of the Right of Person with Disability, 7-10 years ago. But until now, its application is small. No, its full application is a big problem. Where emergency sortie is work for science cultural is a big problem. Work for science cultural. This is a problem. It's important for science, but for science, I have more time because that is probably invisible. No can grow because I don't grow when speaking is tough. This is problem with another type vulnerable. It's a problem this split can grow. This problem with tough is a big problem. After experience of big experience tax proactive project, so I can seize the information in Paris, TTX, have more experience to size all problems. For speaking theoretical, from firemen, from policemen, from medical or type, so can size after Paris to reality for application practical, but reality is particular type because of rain is a problem, but first problem is big, is communication. Is big problem. Emergency sortie have tap voluntary in practice for grow the behavior from firemen, from policemen, communication never. So the man for information with voice, but tap no can information is a problem. No have paper, no have never. The voluntary tap is no have information is a big problem. It's important. Another another more time for grow is competition is practice quite high protocol, unique protocol for all type of CPRN incidents, type because that is one type is upper, but is problem now no have never protocol for top no have now have small the future upper or one protocol you up in future in future emergency sortie is always open for information for all for future for better for life better for protocol are always collaboration. We have contacted my email. We have contacted Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. So if contacted me, great. Emergency sortie. Small keep it for record for collaboration. This for me. I
was not expecting
this. For invitation from emergency sortie.
Thank you very much, Luca. I was not expecting this, but I think it's for the whole Proactive Consortium and for the hard work we've been doing, all of us, to achieve this goal. Thank you. So, I think, yes, we can give Luca a round of applause, and I will let him gain his seat because he's using an app that translates the speech to text, so he can follow the discussions in real time. And we have now a second testimony from another CSAP member who couldn't, unfortunately, travel to Brussels, although he planned it initially. It's Mr. Mohamed Gavad from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, and also the project manager of Project PANDEM-2, so a project dealing with pandemics and the cooperation between Europe and Asia. So if we can play the video that he recorded for us.
My dear colleagues, thank you very much for having me here today. And please excuse my absence for compelling reasons. My name is Mohamed Gawad, and I work as a project manager at the Norwegian University of Life Science. Today, I will be more than happy to share with you some perspectives as a member of the Civil Society Advisory Board on the added value of proactive research projects. In fact, thinking of proactive, I've been thinking, what if we at the European Union face a challenge as severe as COVID-19, or face basically a CBRN event as severe as COVID-19? Are we prepared enough? Do we have the public awareness about facing such kind of severe event? To address this question, I started to think about the relationship between COVID-19 and the CBRN event. On one hand, both events entail a high level of uncertainty and unpredictability, which fuels up the public panic. On the other hand, preparedness came as indisputable key learning lesson from the pandemic. At the heart of preparedness comes community engagement, and to achieve an effective and a resilient community engagement, we need to rely on public trust and sense of belonging. What I witnessed during the exercise of Proactive, I have seen a diverse group of civil society members, regardless their religion, race, and color and ethnicity. We were all united about one objective of how best we can tackle a CBRN event. By our interactions with the other stakeholders, national and regional stakeholders, we were able enough to give a feedback and actually to close the loop of feedback communication between authorities and civil societies and try to address several vulnerabilities and how best to tackle our vulnerabilities, which in return, I feel and I see that at such kind of events has increased the inter and the intra-EU sense of belonging and public trust. So, having such an activities of Proactive, which focus mostly on the CBRN event and how effectively we tackle that, this enhances our public preparedness and public awareness and community engagement. So back to the same question. If we are ready enough to face a CBRN event as severe as COVID-19, I would like to invite you to reflect on this and think of it. And please allow me to wish you a fruitful and successful discussions. And please stay in contact, and I'll be more than happy to see you soon. Thank you.
We can send a virtual thanks to Mohammed for this short recording. And I think we can now open the floor for discussion. So if there are any questions for our speakers, for Tony, for Osa, for Luca. Unfortunately, Mohammed cannot answer live, but if you have any questions for him, we can send them by email and he can answer back. So the floor is yours. I don't know if silence is a good sign at this time of the day. Yeah. Oh. Can we give Jean-Luc a microphone, please? That because online people cannot hear you.
That's true.
So, as we are inclusive, we include everyone.
Thank you very much. Just a comment on the last comment of the witness, which was very interesting. What if a big CBRN event like a pandemic? Again, I would like to stress the point, very important one to my perspective, that this cannot be. In CBRN, either you have an event as big as a pandemic, and then it's a nuclear event, and then we are no more there to tell about it, or it's exactly a biological event. Any other cases cannot be that scale of a pandemic. And this is why, again, I think, even for your project and vulnerable people, whatever they can be, and I really enjoyed the definition and the subtleties about what is a vulnerable people and what is not, and how we can be misled by this. We need to work on this aspect as well. So medical aspect will be also very important. I know that this was not the case in Randst, although it was a biological event. It was, I think we need to state the point that it was more like teaching crisis manager, not as much the focus on first responders, although they were first responders, of course, but it was crisis management that was the focus of it. So, okay, it was like a very good exercise, but maybe not reflecting very deeply what we would like to see in a real bio scenario. In Rieti was a chemical exercise, and again in Dortmund was a chemical exercise. So I think for the future, maybe, that's a comment, it's not really a question, but of course I will enjoy your feedback on this. Medical aspect and biological aspect of this applying to the vulnerable people might be a good outcome of this project. Over to you.
I don't know if anyone wants to react to this. Thank you, Jean-Luc, for the feedback, for the comment. Comments are very welcome as well, and I think we can agree with what you suggest. Not sure, for Mohamed is not here to answer, but given his profile, I suspect he might have thought mainly to the B in CBRN when he made that challenging statement, but it's just an assumption. Eleftherios.
Yeah. Gregor, many thanks for the presentation as well as the quite interesting testimonies. Representing a project, we will have the opportunity tomorrow to speak about the Nightingale. Representing a project about triage, I had to know that, but honestly, we are not brave enough to involve vulnerable groups as you did in Proactive. In my view, in my best knowledge, this is the first project that tries such a thing. And never thought about the triage, which is definitely part when you have victims, either trauma or even CBRN contamination, which I'm trying to recall all the triage algorithms that I have in my mind. First question, walking. What happens with a wheelchair, you know? Second, question is responding to simple questions. Have you ever seen any versions of triage algorithms for vulnerable groups? Are there any versions? Do we ever enter into this domain? It just came out of my mind. But there are fundamental questions in the triage algorithms that cannot be answered for vulnerable groups. And I was wondering if during these exercises, this question came also to your minds.
Eleftherios, I can only say excellent point. Thank you for raising it, and I will just invite my colleague Tony to give you an answer. And anyone else from the Proactive Consortium, feel free afterwards.
Well, answer, I think, is a strong word, because it raises lots and lots of questions every time we get involved in this. I reflect back on Dortmund when a lady in a wheelchair was presented to the decontamination, and they just whisked her straight through without decontaminating her because they didn't know what they should do. She was great because she said, I'm not going home until you decontaminate me. So take me back round and put me through properly. So that was a huge piece of learning for those individuals, because not because they didn't necessarily know what they should do, but they just didn't feel comfortable dealing with those sort of situations. So what they didn't do was ask the person what they needed or how they could help. Or we had another example there of a blind lady. Now, the decontamination process was that at each stage, the person is passed to somebody else, because that's the SOP. So at each stage, they had to start all over again with her. So her thoughts were, well, okay, you may need one extra person, but why can't someone escort me through so they don't have to keep going through the same thing again? Because it's taken you 10 times longer to decontaminate me than if you'd had someone with me. So every time we've done something, the first responders have learned something new. How do you, I mean, Luca mentioned how a deaf person is invisible to you until you know they're deaf. And then what do you do about it? And I think we certainly don't have all the answers. We've got lots and lots of questions that have come out of it, and an inordinate amount of feedback, which will then come out of the findings of the project. And I don't think we'll necessarily be able to produce hard and fast rules about how you deal with a deaf person, how you deal with someone in a wheelchair, because as Ussa said, a wheelchair, they could be an athlete or they could be completely immobile. You don't know until you've had that bit of communication. So add into the mix PPE. Lee said he won't tell you what it's like to be in PPE, but I will, because I've been in it and I'm not in the police anymore. But those of you that have been in it, it is really, really difficult to communicate. It's really difficult to concentrate. So everything is much, much harder. So the information we give the public, so they understand the first responders' job is that much harder, and the information we give the public about self-help and how they help each other, because that's the other thing we've seen at every exercise. Our civil society groups have started helping each other and started supporting each other through the exercise. So I've given you a long and waffly answer because I haven't got an answer, but there's a lot of information in the packs that you've got that might help you with that.
Could I add something? I think Tony did a really good job. But I was also thinking tomorrow I'm presenting our key exploitable results, and we have a list of 11 recommendations, and one of these comes from a study that DH Poll ran, and there was a recommendation about medical triage and lists. And one of the things that we've seen is that vulnerable people have to keep explaining that they're vulnerable. And so perhaps on the triage you could say this person can't walk, but they already couldn't walk before this exercise. So sort of similar to what the point that you made. Yes.
Chaim. Just to conclude on Eleftherios' point, the thing is that the triage algorithms that we use today, I would say it as a medical professional, are not fit for vulnerable people. Because the question is, can the patient walk, yes or no? If the patient cannot walk, automatically the patient is not green. For a person with movement disability, it was the case before, so not necessarily, but there is no other way. We don't have any other option. Someone who has a hearing impairment will not listen to my commands, can follow simple commands. The answer would be no, the patient will become red automatically, not because of the injury, because of a previous condition. So if I may suggest to your recommendation, you need to add that the algorithms used today are just not fit for purpose.
Okay, thank you, Chaim. I think maybe Lee, one last quick question, because we're coming to the end of the session, and quick question and quick answer, hopefully.
I don't know whether you might be able to answer it, to be fair. We're talking around incident response to a spontaneous event. Organisationally, as a law enforcement agency, our best learning is done in planning for major events in terms of risk scenarios and contingency planning. From a vulnerability perspective, the largest concentration of vulnerable people that I've ever been involved with was the Paralympics post-2012. I am conscious the event is going to be held in France. Has there any connectivity being made with that planning as a major event for learning for the project, or equally opportunity of giving that learning to that planning process?
No.
Tony, quick answer.
No, it hasn't. But actually, it's a really, really important point, a really valid point. And maybe our representatives in Paris can probably take that forward for us, I would have thought.
Giving us homework, eh, Tony?
Okay, we can discuss about all this during the networking reception that will follow just now, just in front of the main room. So with this, I think we have to conclude this session because time flies. I would like to thank once more all the speakers, all the participants here in the room and online who had a lot of patience and were connected and followed the conference. So thanks again, everyone. Just a quick reminder that this was just the first day of our 3-day event, so I'll just take the opportunity to remind everyone that tomorrow morning you're expected to come back here between 8:30 and 9, and at 9 sharp we will start with the second day of our joint final conference between eNOTICE, Proactive, and PANDEM-2. Thanks again, everyone. Enjoy your evening in Brussels.